right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where in the art and science of games. I am Josh Bycer, and we have another developer cast lined up for this week's show. We are recording this just before the holiday season shuts us down for 2021, but I'm glad to have back on from Sinister Design to talk about Telepath Tactics Liberated, Craig Stern. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on, and thanks for agreeing to come on just before, again, holiday season is upon us.
It's no problem at all.
So, to get things started with, we spoke with you a while ago. I think this was as you were still working on the game before you kind of did the formal announcement for Liberated.
Mhm.
For people who missed that chat, can you kind of give just like a brief reintroduction as to who you are and what is Telepath Tactics?
Sure. So I'm Craig Stern. I've been developing strategy RPGs, um, and just RPGs and strategy games generally since about 2006 under the name Sinister Design. Telepath Tactics was a game I released back in 2015. It was one of the first, um, possibly at that time, one of the only indie RPGs that was like specifically structured like a Fire Emblem game, with a sort of linear, narrative-driven story, a large cast of characters, and very large
Mhm.
set-piece battles that kind of drove the plot forward. Um, Fast forward to this week, I just announced Telepath Tactics Liberated, which is a ground up remake of Telepath Tactics in a brand new engine with a ton of cool additional stuff. The character portraits have all been redone in a beautiful painterly style with varying expressions. Victory barks have been added. Terrain is now 3D. So, when you shove people into water or lava, you see them sink in. Um, yeah, there's so many things that have been added that it would frankly be boring for me to list them all. But I've got a list on the Steam page for people who want to check it out.
All right. So, for people watching, just for my clarification, so when I tried the demo out for this, this was like, I want to say not the previous summer festival, or it could have been a festival before that. Was that kind of what you
Mm.
were aiming for with Liberated, or like, is this like a new idea for you to kind of like reimagine the first game or remake it?
There was an alpha demo that I put out. Gosh, yeah, maybe last year. It's been a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember when that was put out, but yeah, that was a very much like in progress, early version of Telepath Tactics Liberated that I put out to sort of like show people, hey, this is what I'm working on, to gather feedback from folks on like game feel and other things like that to make sure that I was heading in the right direction. It's gotten polished a lot since those days.
Mm-hmm. And with Liberate, I guess, what is the kind of like the major thing that you're trying to do with this version compared to the very first one?
Let's put it this way: the very first version I found after release that I was butting up against the limitations of the engine it was made in.
Mm-hmm.
The first game was actually made in Flash, which a lot of people don't realize. And there were just problems, there were just problems that it was very difficult to solve in Flash. There were also problems that were just sort of like endemic to the fact that it's a 2D game with elevation effects, right? You can't do a 2D game with elevation effects without introducing distortion into the way the map is presented to the player, right? So, like, for example, right, the most common example of this would be like there are maps with stairs going up, or like there's a hill or a mountain or something in the center, and you would have characters that would be high up and they would want to shoot someone directly to their left.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way to like easily represent that in a way that makes intuitive sense to the viewer without essentially having them just shoot north of where they are.
Okay.
If you're following what I'm saying. There's all kinds of like weird things like that. There's also like there was no way to move behind large like elevation spots. And this introduced all kinds of problems, and there really isn't a good way to solve those problems without changing to 3D. So I changed to 3D. I was like, I felt like that game deserved better, and I wanted to have it realize its full potential. And it just so happened that in the process of doing that, I would also be creating the engine that I want to use for further games that will follow, such as Together in Battle.
That could have been the one that I played then. I think, was that the demo that you put out on one of the festivals as well?
I did put out a demo for that in Steam Next Fest, yeah. Together in Battle follows the story. It sort of picks up shortly after the end of Telepath Tactics Liberated, and sort of continues the story, albeit in like a very different, with a very different dynamic.
Okay. So it's always interesting when we look at games being remastered in these respects, in terms of, you know, where do you want to go with this redesign versus what are you trying to keep or, you know, preserve from that original. So with Telepath, again, being on an older engine and changing these around, are there any elements that are like completely original that you're able to do this time around that you weren't able to do with the original version?
Oh yeah. I mean, some of it I was able to do with the original version, I just didn't have the time, right? But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of new elements to it. There's an entirely new stat characters have called Reflexes, which can be used to mitigate the game's backstab effects. Right? If a character has reflexes and someone tries to backstab them, they will turn to face the attack. And that makes it safer to play a little more aggressively with some of your characters. That was something I added. I changed the way backstab mechanics work a little bit. They are a little bit stronger than they were in the original, notwithstanding the existence of reflexes. If you hit someone with a backstab now, they cannot counterattack, which is also good because in the original you could set up multiple backstabs. By backstabbing someone, they would counterattack and then expose their back to a different space, and that's no longer possible. Yeah, there's tons of new items. I just thought up like new things that I thought would be cool to have in the game. There are shops now that actually the shops in the game now stock a limited selection of procedurally generated weapons that you can buy, and they make each run a little different. Let's see. We've got new skills, about 40 of those. And a lot of those were just things I thought up while I was developing Together in Battle. I was like, oh, this is a cool skill to have. I should put this in the game. And part of it was just wanting to ensure that every character had a wide range of options. Like in the original Telepath Tactics, you know, you've got a cast of give or take about 25 playable characters, and not all of them had the same degree of versatility. There were characters in the original Telepath Tactics who only had like 2 or 3 skills and like kind of made up for it by just being able to use a lot of different kinds of items. But even with being able to use a lot of different kinds of items, those characters weren't super versatile compared to some others. And you know, I was just sort of like, as I was remaking the game, I was like, all right, let's give more tools to some of these characters just to like further expand the options available to the player.
Mm-hmm. So with your work on Together in Battle, and that's kind of been like your project for the last few years now, were there aspects of that game that you found that you decided to go back and with Liberated want to integrate them into it?
Oh yeah. Well, the procedurally generated weapons, right? That's one that I created specifically for Together in Battle, and then I was like, well, why wouldn't I put this in Telepath Tactics Liberated? That's great. So you still have the original items available to you in the shops, but there's a sprinkling of special procedurally generated weapons that you can use to give yourself different tactical options in each playthrough. Procedurally generated characters actually do make an appearance at one point if the player is struggling enough. Procedurally generated characters will show up and join the player so that they're not really low on characters going into a crucial stretch of the game. And it's really interesting because like I've been doing playtests for it now with folks who haven't played any of my games before, and they had absolutely no idea that these were like procedurally generated characters joining them. They were just like, "Oh yeah, more characters." And to me, that's a huge success. That feels good, seeing like these characters fit in with everyone else.
So with the procedural generation for the weapon design, this is something that we see in, I think more specifically, like the Nice strategy RPGs, where weapons will come with, the various residents and things like that. For Telepath, like, how far is the prog gen going? Is it as simple as just, different stats? Or are there, like, certain modifiers or things that can be kind of attached to the gear?
Yeah. So it's not like a Nippon Ichi game. Like there are no residents or anything that crazy, but I've heard it described, and I think this is probably pretty accurate. It's kind of like Diablo 2, right? There's just different modifiers that get attached to different base weapon types, and each base weapon type has like different properties that can kind of scale depending on like what material it's made out of, what quality level it is. And there's just like a bunch of like random modifiers that can be like, you could get like a heavy weapon, and those deal more damage, but they reduce the character's available energy. You could get light weapons, which deal less damage, but increase the character's energy. There's, there's like also like sidearms that can be procedurally generated, and armor that can be procedurally generated with all kinds of different characteristics. Like you could get flashy armor, and that causes enemies to target the character more. Or you could lead-lined armor, which is resistant against light and shadow attacks. There's actually, I think, a kind of armor you can get that is, I want to say it's aquatic, that makes it so the character can swim for free and takes like, I think, 1/10 the normal amount of drowning damage if they get pushed into water. Like there's all kinds of fun stuff that the proc gen equipment system enables.
Now, one thing that I want to ask you about, kind of like as like one of the big points for our topic today, like with like the overall like strategy RPG design, kind of like from a high level, is the variety of tactics that you can kind of like put, or what you like to see in games like this. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this was we recently tried out the game War Tales. That's like kind of on early access right now. It's almost like a more flashier version and less brutal version of Battle Brothers, which I'm sure that's a game you've probably heard of that one as a strategy RPG fan.
I have. So I used to run a site called indierpgs.com, and I actually did an early preview vid of that game back when it was in alpha. And yeah, I haven't played it a whole lot just because I don't have a whole lot of time to play games generally, but yeah, there are a lot of things that it does quite well, I think.
And
I have not played War Tales, though.
Yeah, I just played a little bit of it. Like, it just came on early access, I think late November or early December, one of those two. And the reason why I brought up like games like this has to do with, I guess, designing the tactics of your tactical strategy or your strategy RPG. Like, how far how far do you think games should go in terms of like, I don't want to say having cheats, but having those advanced mechanics. Like as you said with Telepath, I was looking at the store page. Like you can blow up the ground and drop enemies down. You can push them into water or lava, and we've seen like different takes on this from the genre in terms of, is it a case where I can like, through actual quote unquote tactics, get around an enemy, or is it a game that it's so, I think, more limited that all you can do is basically move and attack or move and backstab. And I can see it coming from both ways. That obviously the less tactics you put into the game means the less things you need to balance. But if you put too many things in there, it almost becomes a case of the player just being able to one up the AI. That if you can program the AI to actually make use of all that stuff, then you can just go to town. I've played. There's this game. I can't remember the name of it. I'm hoping someone in chat can remind me. It was a tactical strategy game that had a full physics engine. That you could literally like knock enemies into like a tree, and then the tree falls down. That hits another enemy that knocks him into water. Like it was just like a complete craziness like that. But the AI never does anything with that. It's like it's only on your side.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'll say this. I think it just depends on what you're going for as a developer, right? Like there are people who are very, I think intentionally targeting newer players with their strategy RPG designs, right? Like we're more Tactics Club, right? Super basic. There's not a whole lot going on there. And I think games like that are great because, they are very effective, or they can be at least, as like serving as a gateway to new players into the genre, right? Like Shining Force, right? Like when I was a kid, I loved Shining Force, and I still have a huge, still has a huge place in my heart. Truthfully, a bit of that is nostalgia because I've kind of outgrown it, right? Like I'm a big boy now, and I like playing Fire Emblem, but that said, you can't really beat Shining Force as like an entree into the genre. So you're never gonna catch me, smack talking games that choose to keep it simple. But that said, I've been playing strategy RPGs for decades now, and it's hard to keep my interest with a system that simple. I like games that give me the room to be tactically creative. And that's sort of the key in Telepath Tactics Liberated, right? The game isn't so open-ended that you can just break it over your knee. But there's a lot of different ways to approach every situation. And that, I think, is key to what makes it so satisfying to play. And it's built on a deterministic system, right? Which you might think would lend to it feeling just like a very like rigid puzzle, but no, because there's so many ways to approach every situation. It still ends up being extremely rich and satisfying. But you did hit, I think, on something important earlier when you were talking about AI, because having a big possibility space in a game is only great if the AI can also take advantage of it. Otherwise, you're only getting some of the benefits of it, right? Yeah. Like that. This is something I actually talk about in one of my articles that I wrote a bazillion years ago. I think almost a decade ago now. Called I think it was what was it? Uncertainty and Control in Turn-Based Combat Systems, I think is what I called it. The basic gist, right, is most RPGs create uncertainty in the player by randomizing results. They randomize whether an attack's going to hit. They randomize the damage the attack does if it hits. All this randomness, and you're not really making different decisions as a player. You're just kind of like, oh boy, I sure hope this optimal move I made actually works. And, that's fine, I guess. But I think the superior way to generate uncertainty and tension for someone playing a strategy game is to make the player's choices have the results they intend, and instead generate tension by having there be a large possibility space for ways the AI can react and kick you in the proverbial shins if you don't think through your moves carefully enough. So that is something I've very deliberately aimed to create in Telepath Tactics Liberated. The AI can shove you into the water. It can fling you off cliffs. And it will do it if you don't think carefully about where you're putting your guys.
So, I guess as a follow-up to that point, what are your thoughts on like games like XCOM, or I'm trying to think of some other examples of strategy RPGs where the AI specifically has abilities or talents that the player does not have, and we get it kind of like, that more asymmetrical play between the two sides.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's asymmetrical at that point, and that's valid. That's its own sort of thing, right? I don't really have anything bad to say about that. It's just a different way of approaching the problem, I think.
Yeah. And I think what you said there about letting the player know what their choice is actually going to do. Like, what is this 100% going to do if I, kick someone, or if I throw a bomb or whatever? I think that's very important because you don't want uncertainty when it comes to choices. And that could either be due to the design of the game or even due to the UI. Like, I played some games where the UI is so hard to follow that I'm not quite sure, okay, what happens if I hit him with the fireball, and what happens if I hit him with the ice? I'll get to the sharks coming in a second. I think that may be the game I was thinking of earlier. I played the game Black Legend. This was, I think, earlier this year. It's kind of like a medieval strategy, kind of like a low-tech fantasy kind of game. And their whole unique thing was this kind of, you would hit the enemy with an element, and that would prime them for another element that would then do some kind of effect. But my problem with that game was it was so confusing as to like what things were doing what, that I just lost interest in. Like, as you were saying earlier, with something like Shining Force, or even some like the older Fire Emblem games, like, they're very easy to get into. They're very approachable. And while they may be a little too simple, to hold a lot of interest today, conversely, I don't want to play a strategy game that is just like a confusing mix of, symbols and rules. I just have no idea what I'm looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is definitely possible to go too far and just pile on. I think the problem that some game developers run into is they're piling on stuff in a way that's not intuitively combinatorial. That's the phrase I'm going to go with here, right? Like, the way I try to approach game design is I come up with systems that are in and of themselves very simple, very straightforward, but they interact in ways that are also easy to foresee as a player, but there's just so many of them that it creates this tremendous possibility space, and the challenge is thinking everything through and thinking about, okay, what's going to happen here, what's going to happen here. I feel like a good example of what not to do, right, is to, instead of creating these interlocking systems that expand the possibility space combinatorially, instead just coming up with more and more esoteric effects that are stuck behind symbols, and the player has to go into the character screen and mouse over each of the symbols and be like, what does this do again? Okay, plus 10% chance to synergize with what effect? I feel like I love intelligent systems. I love Fire Emblem, but I'm going to rag on them now. Fire Emblem Heroes, I think, has gone down that path, and it is, I think, hurt the playability of the game immeasurably. Like, if you go on Twitter and just like search for Fire Emblem Heroes, you will see just endless amounts of people making fun of the like multi-paragraph long skill descriptions that have like now
Oh god.
become standard in the game, like because they have this very limited set of systems which work great, but the game has gotten so long in the tooth, and as a free to play gacha game, they've got to keep adding more and more content, and they've pretty much exhausted what you can do with like very straightforward combinatorial mechanics in the game, so they just keep putting in these just more and more convoluted new skills and weapons, because what else are they going to do, right? They've got to keep adding content. They got to feed the proverbial monkey, right? So
Oh yeah, like my next book I'm writing about free to play and mobile design specifically, so that means playing all those gotcha and hero collector games, and it gets very crazy. Ironically, I have not played Fire Emblem Heroes yet, so that will probably be my research tonight after I'm done with all the streaming. And
it's honestly it's a great game, but I think you have maybe missed the golden age for playing it.
Oh no. There's a Final Fantasy Tactics gotcha game as well that I tried that for like a few minutes, and again, it's that issue of we're going to give you screens and screens and screens of symbols and UIs and research, air quotes exactly, Sharky. Replace that with credit card, but no, I'm trying. Yes, again, I know myself. I know not to spend money in these games. It's a very dangerous rabbit hole to fall down.
Oh man, yeah, that's rough. I didn't realize they had made a Final Fantasy Tactics one. I know they. I don't know if it's released yet. I know they were doing a Shining Force gotcha, and like I know there was the Langrisser gotcha. Yeah. They all saw Fire Emblem Heroes printing money and were like, "Ooh, I like money."
Yeah, yeah. And there is the Skea free to play game. I tried that one.
Oh no, really?
Oh yes. I mean, again, like grinding and money, I think go. That's like chocolate and peanut butter, just like chocolate and chocolate for these games. And yeah,
I mean, I'll say this: if any of those games is like set up to really like encourage player grinding infinitely, it's Disgaea. I think they've got the right mechanics to work off of for that.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, like going back to what you were saying in terms of like the UI, I think that is another like unsung hero of good strategy design. Like when the UI can accurately give the player the information they need. Like one of the things I remember was like so much of like the difference between XCOM 2 Day 1 and XCOM 2 War of the Chosen in terms of like for access looking at like, all the mods like people made to make the game more playable, and just saying, okay, let's just take those and put this into this game now.
Yeah, that was actually a big focus of mine in creating Telepath Tactics Liberated, was taking all of the feedback with respect to the user interface in the original Telepath Tactics and just overhauling it, making it just cleaner, more readable, with better layout. Just like, I mean, if you were to fire up the original Telepath Tactics and then fire up, Telepath Tactics Liberated, the difference would be immediately apparent. It's just a much better UI design. And yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with you. Like it's very important, particularly in a game where you're interacting with the user interface all the time, to make sure the user interface is good, right? It's like the difference between Shining Force 1 and Shining Force 2. Can I walk up to a character and hit C to talk to them? Or do I have to go through a whole freaking menu process to initiate a conversation,
Yeah. Like, for me, like, one of my, like, biggest, like, UI pet peeves in strategy RPGs or any kind of, like, tactical Maya game is being able to easily see, am I actually in attack range as I'm moving my cursor around? Because it just drives me crazy when it's like, okay, let me move here. Can I see anyone? No. Okay, undo. Okay, let me move over here. Am I in range? No. Undo. Am I in range over here? No. Or the worst part is that when you do it and the game doesn't let you undo it, then it's just like, oh, well, that's just great.
Oh God, yeah, games without undo. I I have such patience for these days. Like, there's just no reason, unless it's a God of War game. Like, if it's a game where like every time you move it on, it reveals something from Fog of War, I get having the player undo circumstances, but man, other than that, like, there's just no excuse. Just put in an undo button.
Yeah.
That's actually something that I was very intent on supporting, even from the original Tactics. Not only undo, there is an undo stack. Up until you attack people, you can undo all of your moves. You can like set everyone up, make sure everyone's gonna do their thing, and then actually start attacking. And I have from Disgaea respect, although it is less accessible in Tactics than it is in Disgaea.
Craig, you were kind of like lagging a little bit there. I'm not sure if they're.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to just I'm going to hop out full screen for 1 second. You'll see the windows change. I just want to make sure. Yeah, like connection wise between us is good. It could be something on your end, but I'll just give you a heads up if it does happen again.
Okay.
Okay.
Did you catch everything I was saying there? Should I repeat it?
I think we got it regarding only if it was like in like a fog of war situation that it would be, like otherwise just keep it with an undo feature.
Yeah, and Telepath Tactics has an undo stack, so you can undo all of the moves that you've made up to the point where you commit to actually attacking someone.
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to ask you about, again, like in terms of like strategy RPG design, there was a game that I played earlier in, I think this was late 2020, early 2021, called Other Side. If you've heard of that one.
I have heard of it. I haven't played it.
Yeah. It is one of those games that, by the end of my time like playing, I didn't finish it, but I just like kind of want to move on. I was of two minds about whether it was a good or bad strategy RPG. And one of the things that it did is that it really focuses on kind of like a roguelike nature of your characters are like always going to be like at death's door, like because a lot of your skills use your own health, and it's very much about winning the war versus winning the battle, and it requires you to replay and kind of restart your runs. And I just don't know if that system was as interesting as I think the developers intended it to be. Like this idea that you have to replay this game because you are not, unless you are super gamer or you got incredibly lucky, you're not going to win on your first time. It's not the same as like an XCOM where you're going to lose and then you take your knowledge and get better. Like this is, you're going to lose and you have to use what you've earned in that run to then have a better stab at your next one. And my question for you is, do you think like that element of roguelike or even roguelite design fits in a strategy or in a tactical minded game?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by that element, right? If you're talking about meta progression in a roguelike or a roguelite setting,
yeah,
I think that could work. You saw that in Into the Breach, right? With each run, you unlock new and frankly better decks that you can deploy with. I had my own issues with Into the Breach that didn't have anything to do with that, but the meta progression I thought was fine. The key, I think, to making that work with a roguelite is to make sure that your procedural generation is robust enough that each playthrough, each run feels genuinely different. So you're not just doing the same thing over and over again with very slightly different builds.
Yeah, and I think that again is like one of those major points, like something that you were saying earlier about making sure that each skill kind of has a practical application, or that its role is well defined. And then it's just kind of the interaction of all those roles together. Like, as you're describing that, Prey from Arcane, like, just, like, popped into my brain in terms of, like, kind of like that emergent behavior. That it's really just a collection of individual systems and rules that are then kind of combined one another. Oh, and the looks like we have the bots are here as well. Let's get rid of that.
We welcome our robot overlords.
Yeah, they've been. It could be that maybe YouTube finally recognizes I'm the half a celebrity now, that they must be throwing the bots at me now. But back on point, like, making sure that all these aspects, I think, kind of interlock with each other. That, you know, if I shoot a fireball at something that is flammable, I expect it to get caught on fire, and then that fire could spread to other tiles. Unless, of course, there's a tile that's not flammable. And, like, going back to what you said earlier about, like, making sure the UI can properly explain this to the player is very important. Because I think, as we were saying with this idea of, you know, one end of the spectrum, we have, like, very simple, very basic strategy RPGs, and then we have the ones that are very more on the complicated side. If you don't have a good UI, it's very hard to move somebody from one end to the other.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And yeah, I also think that just having skills with very clearly defined roles just automatically helps tremendously with that, right? Like, if I have a skill with, like, let's just take Telepath Tactics Liberated as an example, right? Your character levels up, they hit level 3, they gain Shove. What does Shove do? It lets you shove a character a tile, right? That is some real straightforward shit. You experiment with it, you're like, okay, what can I do with Shove? I can give characters extra mobility by pushing them closer to where I need them to be. I can shove enemies into each other to deal damage to both of the enemies. I can shove enemies into water or lava. I can shove them off a cliff, right? Like, it's intuitive what it does, and it just doesn't require all that much to immediately make a big impact and to interact with all the other systems in the game. Compare that to, like, the kinds of skills that you see a lot of roguelites giving these days, and it's things like, they're just giving these, like, tiny little incremental improvements that are very situational, and it's like, is the player even going to feel that? I mean, like, by the end of the run, I'm sure it will cumulatively have some impact, but, like, I don't know. I feel like there are too many games that just give out skills that don't change much.
Yeah, like, I think the issue is that they're trying to, I think, kind of force depth with their games. That it's like, okay, this skill gives me plus 10% damage if the enemy's on fire, and I'm wearing a green shirt, and I'm using a knife. And so if I find a green shirt and firepower and a knife, it's going, I'm amazing. But again, it's not really something that you can really rely on. I think that was one of the subtle brilliances behind Monster Train, which is not a strategy RPG, it's a deck builder. But what they did really well was they gave you a variety of options that all had the same answer. How do I do more damage? Well, one faction lets me do reflect damage. Okay, if I do reflect damage, what are my potentials that can synergize with that? This faction does magic damage. Let me get more magic damage. And there's fewer choices than compared to some of these other games, but they can be expanded within, like, those, like, kind of like individual universes.
Yeah, I don't remember when this was. I remember there was, like, someone in some context a couple of years ago who was asking me, like, do you do you develop skills specifically to synergize with other skills? And my answer is no, because when you do that, you're mandating a specific playstyle, right? It's like
yes.
the example you gave, right? The plus 10% damage to enemies who are on fire when you're wearing a green shirt and wearing a knife. It's like you're just telling the player to do that. That's not really expanding the possibility space, right? What you need to do is come up with skills that are versatile and that hook into a variety of different systems in a combinatorial way. That's how you expand the play space and create a really, I guess, playful, tactical environment in your game. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah. And like going back to your example of using shove as a power, that shove isn't just like the poor way of doing it would just be saying shove, push enemy one block. That's it. No other connection to that. But by giving it more of that utility, it offers more depth. And as you said, you're not telling the player, okay, if I want to move an enemy, shove is the only answer. I must use this ability. It reminds me a little bit of the difference between XCOM 2 and when they did XCOM Chimera Squad. That in Chimera Squad, because you're using fixed characters, they give everyone crazy abilities right from the start. So you're not dealing with, these blank crash test dummies who have no powers at the beginning. You can start and have somebody use mind control or pull somebody. And this may be XCOM blasphemy, but I think I liked that approach a little bit more than just like the paper doll beginnings of XCOM 2.
Yeah, that's understandable. I can see why you would like that more. I say this as someone who's only played like 30 minutes of XCOM 2 and not any of Chimera Squad, but based on your description, I suspect I would enjoy that approach more myself as well.
And I think another point that I want to expand what you said was about that if you purposely design your skills around these hard synergies. This skill only does bonus when it's fire damage. This skill only does it with ice. It really hurts, I think, the long-term viability of this game, because I see this in a lot of roguelikes, that if it's too defined, you're basically just, your build becomes locked. That, the second I get a knife, well, I know every gear or every perk that deals with knife damage. Well, there's my run, basically decided for me. And I think it's still, again, like Binding of Isaac is still one of those better examples. Or even some games like Enter the Gungeon, and again, some of the other action roguelikes, where you have enough, I think, room to breathe. That's not just, if I take X, I must automatically take Y, Z. It's if I take X, well, maybe I can use A, or maybe I can use D, or choices like that.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's important to give space to players to actually play with the systems that you've given them, right? Like if it's too strict, if it's too rigid, they're just going to take the optimal path that you've pre-created for them. And what's the fun in that, right? You want to, at least I do, and I imagine most developers do, want to create a game where the meta can evolve, where different strategies can flourish that maybe you didn't even think of. That's, anytime I see a player playing one of my games and I see them do that, I see them forge a new strategy I never thought of out of the tools provided, it makes me super happy because it makes me feel like I've done my job as a developer.
So here's I'm not sure how controversial question this is, but what are your thoughts on having content scale to the player in a strategy RPG? And what I mean by that is, if let's say my characters are level 5 and I go into a map, I'm fighting level 5 enemies. But then let's say those enemies kick my butt, I go and level up, I'm now level 7, I return to that map, they're now all level 7 with all the bonuses, skills, and passives that entails.
I think that's something developers have to be very careful with, because it is, especially in an RPG, it is very easy for that to become deeply unsatisfying for the player, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, some of the older, well, older relative to Skyrim, I guess, Elder Scrolls games, right, where they would just scale enemies to your level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not satisfying because part of the central appeal of an RPG is that sense of progression, of becoming stronger and more powerful. Um, and yeah, if everything is constantly scaling with you,
Mm-hmm.
as the player, you never feel that happening, right? Like, yeah, your character's stats went up, but relative to everything around them,
Mm-hmm.
you are the same or even weaker than you were to start. That's just not, that doesn't make for a satisfying play experience. But at the same time, you can't just make the game become trivializable, right, through a little bit of grinding, unless unless maybe you're Disgaea and that's what you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is probably a place for some amount of scaling under certain circumstances, but yeah, that it's tricky to pull off well, and it's not something that I recommend developers just sort of do willy nilly.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm thinking of, I think it was called Regalia of Men and Monarchs.
Oh yeah.
There's an SRPG that I played that does that sort of thing, and man, it was just not satisfying for me to play through it. It was like I'm still fighting like random like birds and snakes and stuff in the wilderness, but I'm not actually getting better relative to them. It just makes everyone in your group feel pathetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the one that I was thinking of was Fey Tactics, and this
Mm.
was 2020. It's from the developer of what was it? Valda's Story, Abyssal City, which is like a very involved Metroidvania. And they did this. They did that with the enemy scaling, but what made it worse was that at one level you unlock kind of like ultimate abilities for your characters. If you scale when they scale up and you hit that point for the enemies now have ultimate abilities, and then suddenly the map becomes, oh well, not only are they better than me in terms of stats, they get their ultras that they can use. There goes my advantage.
Yeah, yeah. It's a struggle. I mean, really, what you want to do as a developer, right? If you're going to try to temper the player's progress, and growing power, what you want to do is to introduce brand new content alongside the old stuff that
Mm-hmm.
is appropriate to their level. So they still have the old stuff to compare themselves to. They can still feel the growth,
Mm-hmm.
but they can explore new things and encounter new environments and situations and enemy types, um, and still be challenged. I think that's probably the way you want to go about it
Mm-hmm.
as a developer. And unfortunately, that requires more work, right? You have to
Yep.
actually create more battles and more enemy types and such. Particularly if you're going for that sort of thing. Although you could also go the Fire Emblem route and just be like, we just have a million different classes, and these are what you'll be facing, but also they're what you'll be using. And in those situations, you just have to introduce variety by having different maps and different objectives and different side objectives and just different situations to switch things up for the player.
Mm-hmm. So another question I have for you, like regarding like the overall like pacing of a battle in these kinds of games, like this is something that I always have like trouble trying to figure out, like what is a good pace. Like there are some games where an individual battle could take maybe a minute 3 to 5 minutes thereabout. And then there are some games where once you start throwing on multiple skills, multiple options that you can play with, it can push like 5-10 minutes plus for just like a simple like 3 versus 3 or 3 versus 4 kind of situation. And I think it's a tough line to walk because pacing is such a very big deal for games like this. Like if you spend like 20 to 30 minutes just like on like the beginner set of missions, it can just like start to feel like a drag to play these games.
I think it depends on a lot, right? Like part of it is what kind of scale are you dealing with in your battles, right? Like if you're playing like Final Fantasy Tactics, battles in that game aren't slow because they're big. They're slow because they're friggin' slow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's bad design, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Whereas, Fire Emblem, the interface is snappy, character movement is snappy. The pacing feels good. Battles are still long, but they're just long because they are grand in scale, right? And to me, it's more about, how does the moment-to-moment feel? How does each turn play versus how long is the battle as a whole? But, others may have different opinions about that.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone has any questions as well from Craig, like we can just sit here and chat this for like the next 2 to 3 hours. But if anyone else has any questions, feel free to let us know in the comments. Yeah, and
oh yeah, I don't think I can see the comments, but just let me know if anyone has questions for me. I'm happy to answer them.
Okay. And I think with like as we look at more strategy RPGs, I guess here's another like very interesting thing that I've seen some do, and that is the idea of a boss fight. Like when you introduce an enemy that has no real comparable, abilities to anything else on the field. Like it's its own unique thing. This was something I think Phoenix Point was like really experimenting with in a lot of cases. Of like having these enemies that it's just like, okay, normal enemy, you can maybe, keep them back, snipe them. No, this is just like this giant thing that it's just gonna kill you. Like it's just if you just stand there and try to shoot it, you're gonna die. Like this is something that Other Side also did with having bosses that could spawn minions and do crazy stuff like that. And again, like this is where we get, full on asymmetric. Like this boss, you're never going to have something similar. Do you think boss fights like that can work in a very like systems heavy game, like in a strategy RPG?
I think they can. I'll say this. I assume you've played Fire Emblem Three Houses, yes?
I've seen footage of it, I haven't had a chance to really sit down and play,
Okay.
but I do know that they do have like crazy bosses in it.
I think Fire Emblem Three Houses is an example of a game doing that well. Like there, and it's not necessarily just bosses, right? There are just enemies that are huge, and they take up a 2x2, just like a 4 square chunk of the battlefield, which limits the areas they can reach. But they're also generally quite powerful, and they play by slightly different rules, right? You have to take them down in stages because they have multiple health bars. And there's no rollover for damage between health bars, and there are you kind of have to like attack different parts of them in order to stun them, and it's a whole thing. And there's really only like one example of it in the game, right? Like, and by one example of it, I mean like it's all over the place, but it plays by the same basic rules in every incarnation, just with slightly different abilities attached. And I don't know, I found that to be a refreshing change of pace. I thought it was done quite well. And it wasn't done in a way that completely throws the basic rules of the game out the window, right? You're still concerned with, dealing strength damage against, defense when you can, or magic damage against low resistance if that's available. And you kind of have to strategize, because you would have to devote a considerable number of your characters to taking these things down before they could get off potentially lethal attacks against your characters. And with each health bar that goes down, they unlock a new ability that makes them more dangerous to fight. So, you've got to really think out how you're going to tackle each of these things, but they're not overwhelmingly difficult, right? You can just take them out if you approach it correctly. It will, require a lot of resources from the player, but it's not like you won't just die if you stand your ground and fight them. Let's put it that way. And I found that to be a very well thought out and well implemented example of that sort of asymmetrical fighting against boss style characters. Typically in SRPGs, I find boss characters are just, regular characters that have stronger abilities than you and a big fat stack of health. And it's fine. I use that because, creating an entirely different set of mechanics just for boss characters, that's a lot. That's a big undertaking. And, I tend to try to focus my developer resources on things that can play into the game as a whole as much as possible, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm going to develop a new mechanic, I want it to be something that slots into that whole combinatorial, mishmash that I've got going on, such that it can enrich the game at any point, and not just when the player is fighting a boss. Mm-hmm. That said, I'm for teams that have the resources and think it's worthwhile to develop unique mechanics just for dealing with bosses, I say more power to them.
All right. Thorn in chat asked, is there any particular advancement in strategy RPGs that you would like to see games experiment with in the future?
It's a good question. I'm hesitant to answer it because I feel like most of the things I want to see games experiment with, I'm just experimenting with myself. Mm-hmm. Let's put it this way. I want to see more games experiment with narrative reactivity. Mm-hmm. And this is something I've actually spoken about before, and by spoken about I mean written articles about. I think particularly back in 2010 or 2011, back on the Sinister Design website, I just had these pieces where I was like, this is what I want to see in RPGs. It wasn't strategy RPGs specifically. It's I want to see more things that produce consequences narratively for player choices. And I should be more specific, right? Because that's been a thing in Western RPGs for decades, right? What I mean is, I want to see more consequences for seemingly inconsequential choices in systems, for example, right? Mm-hmm. I want to see a game where if you accidentally friendly fire someone in battle, the character that gets hit gets mad and holds a grudge against the other character. I want to see battles where there are seemingly inconsequential things like, oh yeah, you accidentally shot a civilian. I feel like, games react to that one of two ways. Either they ignore it or they turn the entire town hostile against you. And that's dumb, right? Mm-hmm. What I want to see is the game takes note of the fact that happened, and then there's dialogue in the town. There's a subset of people who are mad at you, who think you're irresponsible and you shouldn't have been fighting in town. And maybe the mayor calls you in and is like, listen, you gotta leave. Right? I want to see more things like that. Just subtle and surprising narrative reactions to choices you don't expect the game to react to.
And like as you were describing that, it reminded me of another question that I want to ask your thoughts about with regards to games that have long-term consequences to individual battles. And again, Battle Brothers is, I think, a quintessential example of this. This is a game where, by no fault of your own, a character not only gets hit by an arrow, they get hit by an arrow in the eye, and now they're permanently 20% less likely to hit. Or somebody loses a finger, or they develop the plague, or I'm sure there's other things they've added. And like these are things that the player really has no true way to mitigate. Trying to say just don't get hit in a game like Battle Brothers, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I just want to get like what are your thoughts on like games where you have those events that they add personnel, they add like those narrative elements. I know people, Dysentery as well, thank you Matthew, that love like to come with like with ARs for XCOM and strategy games where they take somebody who now has permanent damage or has been hurt and they still work with them. But what are your thoughts on that from like a gameplay perspective like that?
I think it's good. I also think it's very basic, right? Like giving characters permanent injuries is that's not particularly new in games. That's been a thing for quite a while. It's not really a strategy RPG, but a good example I think of when I think of that sort of thing is Dominions 5. That game is wild.
Yeah,
just like the kinds of just.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, that is above my pay grade, the Dominion series, like, trying to learn those games.
Like, just the sheer variety of random stuff that can happen to your commanders in that game. It's just like, what? But it's great. I love stuff like that. I think the area where games are lacking in that regard, by and large, is in terms of having it develop character. And when I say develop character, I mean not just like, oh no, Timmy has a limp now. I mean like, oh, this affects how Timmy behaves. This affects how Timmy talks about things. This affects Timmy's relationships with other characters. And it's entirely possible this is in Battle Brothers and I just haven't noticed it, but I don't think it is. And that's the sort of space I'm really interested in exploring myself, and that's what I'm trying to like delve into in Together in Battle, which will be my next game after Telepath Tactics Liberated is released. Just a game where like your choices directly impact how your characters feel and how they feel about each other, and where you can influence personal choices they're making that have knock-on effects later on in the game.
Yeah, and I think like the other issue for like me with like having like permanent is that once it goes back to what we were saying earlier with like railroading in terms of skills and tactics. If someone permanently loses 20% accuracy with range weapons, well, that just simply means this person will never be a ranger again. And I would love to see, like, when we go like really in depth in terms of like, like, what if we give this character like a magic eyeball or a cyborg eyeball at some point, and now they can do all this kinds of crazy stuff. But then it comes with its own unique setbacks and conditions. And that actually takes me to a point I want to ask you about. In terms of balancing with skills and passes and stuff like that, what are your thoughts on kind of like pure upgrades or pure downgrades versus side grades? So like a choice that, let's say, I get plus 20% sword swinging, but now because I swing my sword too much, let's say my arms get tired 10% faster, or, something like that. Again, the beauty about strategy is we can come with whatever the hell we want for all these rules.
I think it depends on what you're using them for. I'll say this. I think pure downgrades are actually fine to use in an SRPG setting, particularly if you have a large cast of characters. Like the example you gave of like, oh no, Bob lost an eye and now he's bad at ranged attacking. Because you've got a squad of like a dozen characters. Limitations breed creativity. And I think it's actually okay to throw that at the player sometimes. But that said, if characters are losing an eye every single fight, that's just going to get frustrating. So, it's a matter of balancing it out,
Yeah.
Side grades, I think, are fun things to just kind of like throw at the player as an option. Like, do you want to change the way this character plays a little bit without necessarily making them stronger? I think that's great. In Together in Battle, I've got random events where characters will come up to you and ask about changing classes, and you can tell them no, just stay as your current class, or you can tell them to pick one of like 2 or 3 other classes and be like, yeah, do that. You were a sword fighter, and now you are a pyrokineticist who still knows how to use swords. I think, and they'll be less effective at using swords, but they'll still have that ability, and they'll have this new ability, and, they'll become versatile. I think that sort of stuff is really fun. That said, I would not necessarily give a side grade out as like a level up reward. I feel like if characters are leveling up, they should just be getting better, at least in an RPG setting.
Yeah. So that actually is a good segue into this question that I just thought about. What are your thoughts on when you level up, you have to make, very minute or incremental choices, like the ever popular, do you want to put +1 into strength or +1 in dexterity? You can do, 1.1 more points of damage or move 0.67 spaces forward.
I think it depends on what kind of scale you're using in the game numerically. Like, in a Japanese RPG style game where you're dealing hundreds of points of damage per attack, or even dozens of points of damage per attack. No, don't do that. That's boring. That doesn't change anything, really. That's like pretending to do something of consequence in the game. And if the player doesn't feel an upgrade after it happens, you haven't done a good job. That's just my opinion. But, that said, if you're dealing with a system where the numbers are very small, right, like a traditional Dungeons and Dragons style, like everyone starts with like less than 20 health and, doing between 1 and 10 damage is like a lot.
Yeah.
Then yeah, +1 strength is pretty dope. Go for it.
All right.
That's what I think.
Cool. All right. Alberto in chat asks, what about traits like in Fallout, where you will always get one upgrade or side grade, but it will always come with a downgrade? So you're just kind of combining the two together.
Yeah, see, that I like, right? Because that's not a level up thing, right? You're not just, unless I've misunderstood the question. I believe they're talking about perks that you choose when you're first creating a character. I think that's great because that's just choosing a different play style. Right, that's an appropriate time to set that out in front of the player, I think. Whereas, if you're giving that to the player as like a level up thing, if it doesn't actually make them like meaningfully better, that's iffy. I think if you're like giving abilities to the player as they get more powerful, they should, actually get more powerful.
Yeah. And I do like that level of specialization, as Alberto was saying in chat, where, like we said, like, just saying you do 20% less damage because, like, it's not really, something that's interesting. But what if you say you do 20% less damage, but let's say now you move a little bit faster, you move further? Well, maybe I can use this with, backstabbing potential or getting into a position for flanking. And it really opens up the door for more options. And I think, again, like this was like we were talking about earlier with this, having each skill have its own like internal utility, and then like letting everything kind of like interact along those lines, as opposed to, again, being very railroaded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, although, depending on how it's introduced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why not just let the player move further?
Yeah.
Like one thing I do in Telepath Tactics a lot is, characters have energy. And energy it's not like in Shining Force where once you're out of energy, you're just done. You're just stuck attacking with a staff or whatever. You can rest and regain energy. So there's trade-offs everywhere. But yeah, like all of the skills, with very few exceptions, other than like basic attack skills, will use a certain amount of energy. So even when you're just giving the player something that is strictly beneficial, they're still having to make choices about how to allocate their energy and about like what actions to take on a given turn. Whereas I think if you're just dumping stats onto characters, it's very easy to upset balance.
Yeah. And I'll get to Shark's question in a moment, because when you brought up energy, it reminded me of a question I forgot to ask you about earlier. And that has to do with... Actually, there's two parts of this. So the first one, with regard to energy systems, what are your thoughts on having energy be a per battle resource versus, like, let's say, a per campaign? Like, there are some games where your energy only recharges, let's say, when you go rest or you use a special power, versus other games where, like in XCOM, they'll say, okay, this power may only be able to use once every 3 turns or once per battle, but then it comes back the very next day, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. I'll put cooldown abilities to the side for a second and just talk about energy management. I think that gets to a sort of very high level decision you have to make as a developer when you are developing a game. Where do you want the challenge to lie? Do you want to be like an old school JRPG where the individual fights are mostly inconsequential, but you're hoarding scarce resources and doling them out just enough so you can make it through a whole string of them? Or are you of the mind that that's not that interesting? I just want one-off, super intense, deadly fights where you go all out every time. I think those two approaches to developing a game give a game a very different feel, and they locate the challenge in very different places. So, depending on what type of challenge you're looking to present the player, I think that sort of answers the question for you, right? Like, Telepath Tactics Liberated is 100% in the second camp. You go back up to full between fights, but you're going to be using your energy in its fights. And there is some element, I will say, of long-term resource shepherding that goes on as well. There is weapon durability on most difficulty levels in the game, so you've got to be like careful about what you're using when. It's a bit like Fire Emblem in that regard, where you only want to break out the big guns when you really have to, because you don't want to just break your best weapons before you really need to.
Yeah.
But energy is a resource that just gets topped off in between every fight, and that's much more of like a micro level, like, how am I using this? When am I going to need energy later in this battle? You're never incentivized to just do like the old Final Fantasy hit A until you win thing, right? because you want to save all your magic points. That's not how Telepath Tactics Liberated plays it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for me, I'm definitely more of the less into hoarding these days when it comes to like skills or items. Like, I hate to like if a game gives me some ultra powerful skill, but you use it and then you can never use it again for like another 30 minutes. It's like, okay, so when is the opportune moment? Is it when everyone is dead? When somebody just got hit and they're about to die? And I think it's far more interesting. I think again it has to go with the balance. How much power do you put into skills? Do you give somebody the nuclear blast, meteor skill from Final Fantasy, but limited to once per playthrough or something like that?
Yeah, Man, I hate to rag on this game, but that just makes me think of Regalia Men and Monarchs again, because that is entirely how they balance stuff in that game. Is it's all on cooldown timers, and I personally, as a player, didn't find it satisfying. It felt to me very much like a way to force the player to use a lot of different skills, even when they're not really the best option or uniquely suited to whatever situation they were throwing at the player. And it's just a system you have to play around. But it felt very artificial to me. And perhaps there are other examples of games that do that where it's better. But I was not particularly digging it. I will say though, despite that, I do enjoy strategy RPGs where your abilities each turn are limited by a deck of cards. I don't know why it's different, but to my mind, I like it better. And I think the reason I like it better, now that I'm talking about it, is because you get to decide what's in the deck. You balance the options that are generally available to you. So it doesn't feel quite so much like a developer coming in from on high and being like, nope, you can only use that the one time and now you gotta wait 3 turns. I don't know. There's something about it that is, I think, inherently more satisfying. So, like, just for example, Grand Guilds, right? Grand Guilds lets you do that, and I enjoy playing Grand Guilds in a way that I don't enjoy playing games that force you to rely on cooldowns. And it might just be a psychological trick that I'm falling for, but whatever, it works.
All right. And as a time check, we are about an hour and 20 in. And I just want to see if you're good for a little bit longer or do you need to get going.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The other part of my question, because I'm not forgetting about Shark's question, with regard to like energy and actions, one thing that always again, this is one of those weird like ticks when it comes to playing these games for me, is how many actions can I actually do in a turn? Like some games will go you can attack, you can move and attack, you can use a special, or you can move and special, and that's it. Like you cannot attack and move, which that is the thing that drives me crazy. Like that's the thing that's the hill I will die on about what I don't like about some of the modern XCOM games. And then there are games again, like going back to the original XCOM, or even some other examples that my brain is failing to remember, where your actions are based on a pool of points. So if I want to attack, move, or move, special, attack, or as long as I don't run out of points, I'm free to do whatever I want with that character. I just want to see where's your preference fall, or is it somewhere in between?
I don't know that I have a strict preference. I will say this. I do tend to prefer it when games I'm going to preface this. I'm talking specifically about like games where most attacks are in melee range, right? Like fantasy setting style RPGs where you run up to people and attack. I don't think that what I'm about to say necessarily applies with, like, say, XCOM, where you can just straight up shoot line of sight wherever. In those games, I do generally prefer for a character's turn to end when they attack, And the reason is because in games where they don't do that, you end up with this, at least to me, hyper obnoxious situation where you'll be engaged in combat with the enemy, and then they'll attack, and then they'll just kind of run away. And then you have to chase them down and attack, and then they'll attack, and they'll run away. And I just find that so tedious.
Yeah, I know a few games do like the whole like zone of control that like once two characters are kind of like locked in, if one tries to break away, they get like a free hit or they get like a penalty of some kind. But yeah, like that does get annoying.
That is a solution, and that's what Battle Brothers does, right? My problem with that is that it goes too far in the other direction. Once the lines are met, they're like stuck. And the battle becomes very static, and it's just about rolling to see who hits and kills each other first. And I don't find that terribly interesting either. To my mind, you want a system that encourages the player to maneuver, but simultaneously doesn't just become this, like, game of tag. And to my mind, I think the move and attack and that ends the turn system largely accomplishes that. I will say, at least in Telepath Tactics Liberated, there are certain characters who learn abilities that allow them to keep moving or even to use other skills after they've attacked. But it's limited. It's like a tactical option rather than like the core of the game. Like you have bowmen who are sort of like long-range skirmishers. They can move, fire an arrow, and keep moving. And you have like cavaliers who can, they have what in Fire Emblem is referred to as super canto, right? They can move, attack, and keep moving afterwards because of their extreme mobility. And that's like a fun thing, right? That's like just a fun thing that distinguishes those classes from the other classes. But I think if every character could do that, it would very quickly become annoying.
All right. Let me get to Shark's question, and then I think I have one more general question, and then I'll throw it to you if there's anything else you want to discuss, and then we'll kind of go into our wrap-up. So Shark wanted to ask, like, what are your thoughts on a game where, this goes back when we were talking about, like, leveling up and making choices. What are your thoughts about a game where every time you level up, you lose stats and you get worse, but you start out overpowered? Because this was an idea that I know he's been like playing around with.
Yeah, that was. I actually floated an idea like that in one of my old articles. I thought it would be kind of fun to do like an inverse RPG where, like, you're like someone in this town that's, you drive off bandits, and in revenge they secretly poison the town's well, and you've ingested this poison, and you have to like journey the land in search of a cure, and all the time you're just getting weaker and weaker. I think that could be fun and satisfying potentially, but it would be a very different sort of experience, I think, from your typical role-playing game. And there is actually, since I put that out, and many years after, there's a game called Farabelle, which is on. I know it's on the Switch. I'm sure it's on Steam.
What was it?
Farabel. Farabelle.
Oh, here it is.
It's just like, it has this time travel motif, and the idea is you start at the end of the campaign with the big climactic confrontation, and then you progress backwards. And each time you progress backwards, you lose experience and you lose stats. But theoretically, right, you're facing weaker enemies every time, but it's still more challenging with each successive level. So it still maintains that progressive, difficulty curve, while removing stats from the player. I think it's a very clever implementation of it. I found the actual tactics on offer in Farabel a little too limited for my taste, but just as a concept, I think it's a very good one. And I would love to see more games take a crack at it and maybe do it in a way that manages to meaningfully expand the possibility space as the game progresses, even while reducing character stats. I think that would probably be a formula for doing it in a way that at least I would really quite enjoy.
Yeah, like for me, there's a concept that I really want to see more developers experiment with that was from Breath of Fire, Dragon Quarter from back in the day, where your main character is dying slowly, and what's killing him is this like all-consuming superpower. So you can use this power in different ways that every time you do it, it becomes more corrupting. But when you do it, it inherently just breaks the game for you for a few seconds. Like you can lose like it's like all percentage based. You can add like 5% more, and you now have infinite movement for his turn. You can go anywhere on the field, or like you could literally spend I think like 10 or 12% of your overall time, and you will one hit kill any boss in the entire game. Like this is an ability you can use at any time that you want, provided you have 10% of your meter left. So there's like one boss in that game that I have literally never fought legitimately because it sounded like such a pain. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just like purposely going to reserve 12%, and when I get to this boss, one turn, one hit kill. Yeah, hardest boss in the game. No, he's dead.
That's really interesting. I like that.
And it was a very clever idea. And if you hit 100% though, and you get fully corrupted, it's game over. So you're constantly have to weigh, when do you break the game for yourself, and when do you play it legitimately.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I feel like that would be very hard to balance, right? How do you signal to players like when is it actually worth it to do this?
Yeah.
How much time do they have left? How do they know if they're like really budgeting their time left effectively? But conceptually, just like on a high level, it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, the game was linear, which I think kind of helped. Like, I think it's like the main play was only like 2 to 3 hours long, and then like replayability comes in with having more stories and more paths unlocked. It's a very like experimental game. It's from the developers who went on to do Dead Rising, so they kind of took some of those lessons in terms of replayability and powering up, and kind of applied it to that one.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, and this is the final, I guess, design question. Again, we can sit here all night long and talk about this stuff. And when you get closer to Together in Battle coming out, we can certainly have a follow chat about that one.
Yeah, I'd be delighted.
So one of the things I want to talk about, kind of like as I mean, this is a good like final question about what we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
How much should the tactical side matter? And what I mean by that is that there are plenty of strategy RPGs and tactical games that they will just overwhelm the player. Like if I have a max party of 4, they may have me fight 6 to 10 enemies in a single fight. And in this case, stats only go so far. Like you need to like it becomes a case of, again, like we said earlier in terms of pacing, that you need to basically spend like 2 to 3 minutes on each turn and try to play it super carefully. And one mistake, some enemy breaks through the line or gets behind you, you're in deep trouble. And then there are of course games where the stats really do matter, again like Disgaea. Like you could play Disgaea very tactically, or you grind the item world, and then your one character just like goes like this and does 999 damage, and there's no tactics. But of course, that is its own unique system, as we always say when we bring up Disgaea.
Yeah, I think there are two different sort of breeds, so to speak, of player when it comes to this. I think there are people who are in it to grind up characters and customize their builds and make them play exactly the way they want to. And they don't really care that much about having a tactical challenge. And then there are players who are all about being challenged tactically, and what they want is to be handed the tools to do something really cool with an elaborate scenario that is carefully balanced around what they have. And I think that Group 1 are people who absolutely love Final Fantasy Tactics, and Group 2 are people who absolutely love Fire Emblem. And personally, I am much more of a Fire Emblem guy, but I respect that the Final Fantasy Tactics guys exist.
Yeah, and I think like what you were saying there about, coming up with those situations. Like, I always use the term like punching up in this respect, because I see this a lot in some of like the mobile games I've played, or even just in RPGs in general, that if you have sound tactics and a solid build, stats may not matter as much. Like, I've played games where I can punch up an enemy who is several levels above me, and because I prepare, properly, I can win. But conversely, there are games where, even with sound tactics, it's basically like you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. Yeah, you can dance around all you want, you can, have the right skills, but if this guy just, one shot kills you, you're done. Like, there's no tactics to avoid a one-hit kill.
Yeah. Right. Like, I mean, depending, right? Like, in Fire Emblem, there usually is some kind of tactic to avoid a one-hit kill, right? You just are very careful about who you put in range of whom, and, you take advantage of terrain and yada yada. But that's a game where the developers know exactly what you have going into each fight, and they're able to balance it around that. And, that's just something you can't do if you're a developer who's flung the floodgates open and said, yep, go ahead and grind for as long as you want, right? Like, not unless you're willing to introduce level scaling, and that is, as we've discussed, a whole bucket of worms unto itself.
Yep. Oh, yes.
So, like, Disgaea is the one game I give a pass for doing this, because they're they lampshade it. They know full well what they're doing, and they straight up break the fourth wall telling you, yeah, this is a grindy-ass game. Have fun.
Break it, Here are all these little... Here's all the sledgehammers. Here's a wall. Do what you think is best with these two situations.
And, like, a little bit of grinding isn't necessarily bad. It can be good, depending on how it's implemented, but, like, I think it's just, there are too many games that, at least to my taste, I should preface this, to my taste, there are too many games where they let you fight battles for as long as you want, and level up as much as you want, and the developers don't have any sense at all of how strong you are once you get to certain battles. And so you get those battles, and it's like hitting a brick wall, because they just assume you've maybe been grinding, and then it becomes mandatory. You have to grind now in order to actually progress. And I don't know. I think part of it is just becoming older and having less time to play games, but I don't want a game that's going to force me to fight the same battle over and over again in order to progress to new, interesting battles. I want a game that's going to be interesting consistently, delivering new scenarios every time. And, in order to do that, you really can't have a game that centers around grinding. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, again, that I'm not a fan of these days as well, is when you have those intentional difficulty spikes, and then the side quests become required side quests. It's optionally required. And that just it just saps your will. Like, unless you're unless you were already going to do 100% of the game, then that's no big deal. But yeah, there's a lot of games that fall into that trap where if you don't do those side quests, the stat imbalance or just the rules become stacked against you. You do that side content, then you just steamroll over everything because you're now 5 to 10 levels higher because you did all that.
Mm-hmm. I will name drop one series that I think did a pretty good job with that. Um, Braveland. Are you familiar with Braveland?
No.
All right, so King's Bounty: The Legend, King's
Oh
Bounty:
yeah.
Armored Princess. You're familiar with those, right?
Oh yes.
Braveland is. I say this in the most affectionate way possible. It's kind of a low rent knockoff of those games, but it's incredibly charming and genuinely quite fun in its own regard. I actually think I like it better, frankly, than the games it's knocking off. But yeah, no, it's got this very like low rent like flash game look to it, and the story is just absolutely threadbare. It's very basic, but what it does well is it's very finely balanced.
Mm-hmm.
Every situation you get into, you know, the developer has created this scenario knowing what you have and what you're bringing to the fight, and they've created these scenarios around it that challenge you to try slightly different tactics for slightly different enemy compositions and slightly different battlefields. And it just works well, particularly once you get to Brave Land 2. The first one's a little shakier. But yeah, once you hit like the second and third games in the trilogy, they start introducing these areas where you can go for optional battles, but they're limited. You can only do it like 3 times, and then they're done, and then you're just progressing. And if I'm being honest, I think they probably still balanced the game around the assumption you were going to do them all, which is maybe counter to the point, but I feel like if a game were going to introduce grinding in that way, that would be, if they were to do that and then balance the game around the assumption that you are not actually doing the grinding, I think that would be a smart way to do it, right? Just introduce enough that a player can spend a little bit of time to sort of proactively lower the difficulty level for themselves a little bit without making it mandatory and without creating this huge, fundamentally uninteresting time sink in the game.
I did look up as you were describing it, and they did do a spiritual sequel, Spaceland, that I did play. This was, I think, a while ago. So they're still working on
it. They did make Spaceland. I think it's different from Braveland. Like, mechanically, I think it's much more like, XCOM style.
Yeah. And I do love the whole King's Bounty kind of style, like having like building your armies along those lines. I tried the latest sequel that came earlier this year, and it just did not work for me.
I haven't played that one. I heard it was bad, and I hate to say it, I just don't have time to play bad games anymore. I'm just really busy all the time, so I just didn't play it.
I do have the time, but I make the stream suffer while I play it. All right. I guess before we kind of wrap things up, just a little bit more about when the games are coming out. Anything else strategy RPG related design wise that we didn't touch on that you'd like to discuss?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so many things. I'll just add this because I forgot to mention it at the start. One of the super big, I think, improvements Telepath Tactics Liberated makes over the original Telepath Tactics is that character promotions are now branching. In the original Telepath Tactics, it was very much like Shining Force. You promote someone, they become the next thing, and it's better, but you don't really get any say in like what it is. Whereas now, there are 24 base classes in the game and 48 promoted classes, and each character gets a choice of 2 different like branching promoted classes to choose from. And it's not just like, this class gets more of this stat and this class gets more of that stat. It's more like the prestige classes also get buffs to specific abilities to make certain abilities work better for them, right? Like, for example, I'll just give one example. Mentalists in the game, right? Mentalists have, as you would expect, mental attacks. They have a basic attack called Mind Blast, which hits at one range. Very good against spirits. They gain an ability called Mind Shock, which can stun at slightly longer range. And they have an ability called Mind Control, which inflicts the status effect Enthralled and allows you to take direct control of an enemy this turn. Very fun. When a mentalist promotes, they get a choice. They can become one of two. Gosh, what are the names? One of them is, I think, I don't remember the names of the classes. It's escaping me right now. But one of them, right? Not only do they get more psi and more energy, they get a boost to the range of mind control, right? So they can now control enemies at greater range, which is super fun. Whereas the other one, Mind Shock, becomes better. It gains a boost to range and a boost to damage, and it becomes just this very effective offensive tool. And it's all about how do you want to play the character, right? Like every single class in the game has these choices. Assassins can upgrade to either blackguards or whispers. A blackguard gains strength and access to throwing knives. So now suddenly you have a ranged attack that you can use with your assassin, which is super cool. Or they can become a whisper and they gain access to the skill Hide, which allows them to literally become invisible to enemies for a turn. So they can just sneak around behind enemy lines and get in position to backstab the hell out of someone you want to backstab. Super fun stuff. And that is one thing that I think is just a very impactful addition to the game with Telepath Tactics Liberated.
Nice. All right. So I think with that, to kind of begin to wrap things up, I think we were going to go this long, but again, that's the joy of like these kind of discussions. They can get very meaty. But for people listening to us right now, do you have a release date for Telepath Tactics Liberated?
Sure do. March 14th, 2022. That's when it's coming out. I was originally going to do it in February, but then I was like, wait a minute, that's when Steam Next Fest is happening, and no one will be available to cover the game. Let's do March. So March 14th, that's when it's coming out.
Oh god, that means I'll be spending Next Fest playing another like 60 to 70 games, so that's good for me. And do you have any update regarding Together in Battle, when that one will be released?
Yes, Together in Battle I have pushed back until later in 2022. I don't have anything more specific about that because, well, frankly, who knows, how long I'm going to be spending, tending after Telepath Tactics Liberated post-release. We'll just see how that goes. But certainly I think like summer, fall, maybe winter 2022. Together in Battle will be hitting early access, and since Together in Battle is more of a roguelite structured game with proc-gen characters and events and such, that one is going to be going to early access and be getting continuous development for some time.
And you beat me to my other question, too, there.
Yeah, that was another reason why I ultimately decided to release Telepath Tactics Liberated first is, Telepath Tactics Liberated is going to be a one and done. It's out, I'll patch it for a while, and once it's in good shape, I'll be like, sweet. Whereas, Together in Battle, that's going to be a long-term commitment, and it made more sense to get Telepath Tactics Liberated out first under those circumstances.
All right. So, I think with that then, are you planning on releasing them on any other platforms besides PC?
Yes. Tentatively. I'd very much like to get Telepath Tactics Liberated onto Switch. I just think it would do... I mean, it would certainly fit well there. The Switch has such a great library of strategy RPGs that I think it's already a magnet for people who like that sort of game already. It just seems like a good market to release it into. As far as, how easy it'll be to get working on Switch, I don't know. I've never developed for Switch before. We'll find out. Worst case scenario, maybe I'll just like hit up a publisher and be like, hey, wanna port my game in exchange for some of the money, and maybe they'll do it. I don't know. We'll see.
All right. So I think with that, do you have any social media, links, plugs, anything like that you'd like to mention?
Oh yeah. On Twitter, I am at Sinister Design, all one word, and my website is sinisterdesign.net. And if you want to find Telepath Tactics Liberated on Steam, well, I'll just plop the link down here for you, and maybe you can add it to YouTube or something. Sure. I'm going to be updating telepathtactics.com to redirect there, but I haven't done it just yet.
Right, I got it. I'll post that in chat, and I will also include this in the show notes when this goes up. Recorded.
Excellent. Yeah, anyone that is interested in this game, you should definitely visit the page and wishlist and follow. That would be dope. And tell your friends.
Yeah. And I guess the final thing then is, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching? Any final point to end our little chat on?
Oh, gosh. Hi, thanks for watching. Great to see you. I can't actually see you. I assume your webcam probably has tape over it anyway. But thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed watching this interview. Thank you for being a fan. I love fans. Yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Born, what is the meaning of life? That's another. We'll have to get that for the next chat when we have another 2-hour chat. What was that?
42.
There you go. But yeah, Craig, again, it has been a pleasure chatting with you this evening. Best of luck with Liberated, and see how Together in Battle comes. And yeah, when we have some more time and there's more, I'm sure there always will be more to talk about here. We're great to have you back on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Ah, yes. All right. Hang on the call for just 20 seconds after. I just have a few quick things to go over with you. But for those of you watching this live or recorded, that is going to do it. So do all that liking and subscribing. You'll find links to our Discord and such down below, as well as my books on design. And if you are a developer working on an upcoming game or just want to talk design, feel free to get in touch. We're always looking for new and returning guests. For those of you watching this live, I will be back later tonight for our game stream, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, everybody, take care.